The Women on Farms Project, a proud member of the South African People's Tribunal on Agrotoxins, is taking a stand, and farm workers are putting the South African government on trial in the court of public opinion for its failure to uphold constitutional duties, particularly the right to life. The trial will then focus on the harmful impact of agrotoxins on farm workers and their surrounding communities, also highlighting the urgent need for government action in order to protect their health as well as well-being. Well, to further unpack this, let's now extend a very warm welcome to Colette Solomon, Women on Farms Project Director. Colette, we do appreciate your time. Happy Human Rights Day to you. But is it really a happy time of reflection for those women who are still battling for their rights to better health protection at their places of employment in these farms 30 years into democracy? Please unmute, Colette.
Yes, we've chosen this Human Rights Weekend to have the People's Tribunal on pesticides. And it really is to highlight the fact that 30 years into our democracy, farm workers who produce much of our food, who are also contributors to the agricultural economy of our country, that those workers on Human Rights Day, just to expose the fact that their human rights are still being violated. They still are not enjoying the right to dignified workplace. They are still being exposed. Their health impacts are still being impacted by the exposure of to highly hazardous pesticides during the course of their work. But it's not only farm workers who are affected, but it's also communities who live around commercial farming areas. So the tribunal is being held to hold our government to account, to hold the companies that produce these hazardous pesticides to account, and also the farmers, employ farm workers, but who do not comply with the basic legislation of workers' rights in South Africa.
Colette, I mean, why do you think these cries of these women are still not being heard, even through various campaigns as well as initiatives to bring about their plight to light? I mean, we've seen similar campaigns in, for example, the mining sector, resulting in massive class action and even rebates for those that were claimants. So why are we not seeing the same type of, similar type of reaction and action regarding women as well as communities that have been exposed to these injustices for so long?
So it's important to locate the current agriculture and the agricultural sector within the history of our country. So we do know that many of the farm workers, for example, who continue to work on farms, they can trace their ancestry back to the slaves who worked on the first European plantations and vineyards and farms in South Africa. And we know that in the context of both colonization, land dispossession, apartheid, we have really the context of exploitation of black farm workers has been part of our history since colonization. And although after 1994, we had the introduction of many progressive labor laws, however, the context, the power dynamic, the context that exists between farmers and farm workers, that still really reflects the inequalities of our past, but also reflects the continued and persistent inequalities today, where farm workers are wholly dependent on farmers for their livelihood, often for the house where they live, and farmers really can decide to comply or not comply because there are thousands of workers who are waiting for that job. So, and coming from a history where farmers really, there were no laws that regulated labor relations on farms. Farm workers had no rights during the apartheid years. So farmers still come with that attitude of, that workers really work for them and have no rights. So within that context, we still find a massive power imbalance where farm workers have very little rights and a very little voice. And to a large extent, the struggles and the experiences of farm workers continue to remain largely invisibilized. You know, violations take place on private farms or privately owned land. So a lot of the exploitation and the rights violations that happen out of sight. Farm workers are also living and working on farms which are very far apart. They're scattered. Unlike miners, for example, who work together, they are in a concentrated area, they can organize, they can mobilize, and so on. For farm workers, this is very, very difficult. And even for farm worker trade unions, you know, the issue of private property makes it very, very difficult for trade unions to organize on private land. So therefore, the struggles, the experiences of farm workers, including their continued exposure to pesticides, is something that remains invisible, remains unseen, and also has become normalized. So for generations, farm workers have been exposed to pesticides. While they are working in the vineyards, pesticides are sprayed. They are not provided with any protective clothes. They are not provided with toilets and water and so on in the vineyards. So the issue of farm worker exposure to pesticides while working has become completely normalized. It has been happening for generations. So for us, an important part of the tribunal is also to raise public awareness about this normalization of a rights violation that happens on most farms in South Africa, and most of the farm workers on those farms are producing the food that we eat, the fruit that we enjoy, and the wine that is sold and exported to countries in the global north.
And it's quite a myriad of issues that these women on farms actually face, Colette. I mean, I know you mentioned a few, but besides just exposure to agrotoxins, I mean, it's little to low wages, no access to actual land. We know that there's also rapes that are also taking place, as well as non-adherence to the basic policies, like even your minimum wage. So let's talk about this initiative then that you've said aims to hold government to account. How will these engagements then proceed, and what do you also hope to achieve post this engagement?
So the tribunal will take place over 1.5 days. Farm workers and communities that are directly affected by exposure to highly hazardous pesticides and agrotoxins, they will give evidence. And it's important to know that because the tribunal is a community-driven space and so on, at the heart of the tribunal are the experiences and the need of affected communities like farm workers. So a big part of the day tomorrow will be taken up with farm workers and other affected communities giving testimonies of how their lives, their health, and even their families through cancer, through death, have been impacted by exposure to pesticides. And they will also shed light on the fact that our government has failed farm workers in a number of ways. As you say, there are laws in South Africa that should be protecting farm workers, but there is a great, widespread prevalence of farmers not complying with the law. And that is where our government should be intervening to enforce the law and to make sure that farmers who are non-compliant are actually prosecuted. So there is a failure of government to enforce the labour laws that we have. Another issue that, with respect to government, is that there is a lack of transparency with regard to the registration of pesticides, the regulation of pesticides, the legislation that regulates the context of pesticides.
All right.
It's very outdated, very fragmented.
All right, Colette, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Yes, unfortunately, Colette, we're out of time. Thank you so much for your input this afternoon. That is Ms. Colette Solomon there, and she is the WFP campaign director, as of course farm workers take government to account over a myriad of issues, including exposure to agrotoxins.